Hi there! In this video, we're looking at what's known as the game of the century, played by a 13-year-old Robert James Fischer, who would later become the 11th world chess champion. This game took place against the strongest chess player in the USA at the time and multiple-time US champion Donald Byrne in 1956 in New York. It was right after this game that people realized this 13-year-old kid would, in the future, crush everyone and everything. So Byrne's got the white pieces, and Fischer's playing black. Donald Byrne starts things off with knight to f3. Fischer responds symmetrically with knight to f6. White continues with pawn to c4, and we get pawn to g6 from black. Fischer's preparing to fianchetto his dark-squared bishop. White develops his second knight to c3, and we see bishop to g7. Pawn to d4 comes next, and white fully occupies the center. Black, for now, castles kingside, not pushing in the center just yet. Bishop to f4. Byrne develops the last light piece on his queenside while he's still delaying his kingside development. He's playing in the center. Black, in this position, of course, answers with pawn to d5, right in the center, the most principled continuation, the Grunfeld defense. Byrne plays hyperactively here, bringing his queen out to b3. Not the best move, really, but Donald Byrne, counting on his superiority, allows himself to play like this. Fischer captures on c4, and after the recapture with the queen, his pawn on c7 starts hanging. He plays pawn to c6, restricting White's knight in the center on c3. White, taking the opportunity, continues his central activity with pawn to e4, seizing space. Black's knight goes to d7, with the idea of heading to b6 to disturb White's queen. White continues his energetic play, bringing the rook to the center with rook to d1. The black knight arrives on b6, attacking the queen, and the queen is forced to retreat, but it goes to c5, not allowing Fischer to breathe even a little bit. And we get bishop to g4. Fischer develops his last light piece to g4, eyeing the knight on f3. And after this move, Donald Byrne starts to overstep. He places his bishop on g5. For the second time in the opening, he's moving the same piece, and his king still hasn't castled. The bishop is still sitting on f1. The genius of Bobby Fischer awakens, and he finds the strongest tactic in this position. Knight to a4. Sacrificing his knight on a4 almost for nothing. White, after calculating the variations, starts to understand that sitting across from him is a true chess monster. The whole point is that taking this knight is completely impossible. For example, the following variation could occur after capturing the knight. Black takes on e4 with the knight, attacking the queen and aiming at the bishop on g5. Whichever continuation White chooses, he ends up in a lost position. As an example, I'll show one of the lines. White might grab the e7 pawn, and following the trade with bishop takes on f3, then queen takes on d8. Several piece trades occur. Rook takes on d8, bishop takes on d8, bishop takes on d1. White's knight and bishop face attacks. He might return his knight to c3, defending with the pawn while simultaneously threatening the d1 bishop and the e4 knight. However, then arrives rook takes on d8. Following knight takes on d1, black executes rook takes on d4. This creates an arrangement where Robert Fischer possesses an additional pawn, plus total board domination. White's king remains uncastled, the bishop remains stationed on f1, the knight trapped on d1. The rook would, on subsequent moves, penetrate via the d-file, consuming every pawn in sight. Additionally, that powerful bishop from g7 controls all central dark squares. This doesn't even represent the most devastating continuation that could follow White's capture of the offered knight on a4. Consequently, White avoids this knight, instead discovering the optimal response. He withdraws his queen to a3. Now he can potentially capture this knight with the queen, while his knight simultaneously guards the e4 pawn. But now arrives knight takes on c3. A trade occurs. White reclaims with the pawn, and the knight still grabs the e4 pawn. Black's knight gains activity, though the e7 pawn becomes exposed, which White immediately exploits. He captures with bishop takes on e7. It appears that Black in this position will lose his f8 rook, since both his queen and rook face threats.
The queen requires protection, and Fischer positions it on b6. Donald Byrne, after thinking a while, decides against capturing the available exchange, the f8 rook. The reasoning is that if he executed this capture, black would counter with bishop takes on f8, and following the queen's withdrawal, perhaps to b3, seeking naturally to trade queens since he'd possessed the extra exchange, black would execute knight takes on c3. Once again, the knight gets offered, though it's obviously impossible to accept with the queen, because then would arrive a pin with bishop to b4, targeting the d1 king. But if he doesn't capture this knight, say following queen takes on b6, the black rook would activate and penetrate either via the a file or similarly via the e file. White's king remains uncastled. The knight hangs threateningly over the position. White would merely fail to survive in this arrangement as black's piece activity would prove too crushing. Therefore, white similarly dismisses capturing the f8 rook in this sequence. He at last activates his light-squared bishop with bishop to e2 and prepares on the following move to castle. But Fischer, that scheming kid, doesn't let him have his way. He grabs on c3 with the knight, repeatedly offering the piece on c3. Accepting this knight remains disadvantageous. Then black would activate his rook to e8, creating a pin on white's e7 bishop toward the king and capturing it subsequently. White's position would remain defeated.
But white discovers the sole optimal move, bishop to c4, threatening the queen while simultaneously enabling the c3 knight capture. And now the e7 bishop will no longer be vulnerable for white. Nevertheless, black initially delivers a check with rook to e8. The king is compelled to forfeit castling privileges, king to f1, and we arrive at 13-year-old Robert Fischer's most spectacular move. He executes bishop to e6, threatening white's light-squared bishop while offering his queen on b6. Bobby's queen on b6 faces attack, as does the c3 knight. Regardless of white's choice here, his position becomes defeated regardless. For instance, if white accepts the e6 bishop, then a forced mate sequence against white unfolds. Queen to b5 check. Now there's no blocking possibility. White must flee the king to g1, because moving to e1 would deliver mate in 1 with queen to e2, since the knight alongside the queen controls the square, trapping the king. Knight to e2 check. The king is compelled backward to f1, and knight to g3, a double check against white's king from both knight and queen. The knight cannot be captured. If the king retreats again to e1, then queen to e2 delivers mate, and if king to g1, then arrives an elegant smothered mate. Black offers his queen on f1. This queen cannot be accepted by the king as the knight defends it. White must capture with the rook, and then knight to e2. This demonstrates how black's pieces would enclose white's king, and the black knight would execute the final mate. Therefore, in this arrangement, accepting the e6 bishop is impossible. However, what if white accepts the c3 knight? Indeed, that would represent the optimal choice here for white. Then, naturally, black would capture on c5 with the queen, exploiting the fact that following the recapture, bishop takes on c3 would occur, and still the position could emerge still victorious for black. He'd possess one additional pawn, the two bishop advantage even following trades, capture, capture, activate the second rook, and dominate the crucial e-file. The rook would penetrate e2, consuming all remaining white queenside pawns and triumph. Therefore, this continuation would similarly fail to rescue white's pieces. Consequently, Donald Byrne selects the third alternative, not the most apparent one. Here, white doesn't forfeit immediately, so he accepts on b6 with the bishop. He accepts the queen offering, though then follows bishop takes on c4 with check. The king is compelled backward to g1. Black's knight and bishop commence their lethal windmill, knight to e2 check. Takes on d4, once more a discovered check. The king must relocate, king to f1, once more knight to e2 check, and now knight to c3, a discovered check. The king withdraws once more, and at last black captures white's b6 bishop. White's queen faces attack. The rook joins the offensive along the file, and the queen advances, similarly threatening the black bishop. The rook ascends like an elevator, activating itself while defending the c4 bishop with rook to a4.
e4. The a4 rook receives protection from the c3 knight. Black's pieces commence tremendous activity. White's queen captures the b6 pawn, and black at last captures the d1 rook. For the offered queen, Robert Fischer obtains a rook and 2 bishops in this arrangement. Here, white urgently creates breathing room for his king with pawn to h3, intending to shelter him on h2 and activate his remaining inactive piece, the h1 rook. White faces serious material deficiencies, so connecting the rook to operations is crucial. Fischer captures the a2 pawn, advances his rook to the second rank with rook to a2, and the f2 pawn becomes vulnerable. White's king shelters on h2. The rook activates with rook to h1, threatening the d1 knight. The knight captures on f2, counterattacking the rook, and we get rook to e1. White proposes rook trades. Fischer accepts on e1, and following the intermediate check on d8 with queen to d8 check, he interposes with bishop to f8. White captures the e1 rook with knight takes on e1, and we now reach the following arrangement. Fischer retains a rook and 2 bishops against White's queen. White's king confronts a lethal mating offensive. Excessive black pieces remain active. Therefore, Robert Fischer executes bishop to b5, targeting the vulnerable point in White's position, the g2 pawn. White reactivates his knight with knight to d3, obstructing the bishop's influence, and Fischer centralizes his knight to e4. White threatens the black b7 pawn with queen to b8, pawn to b5, merely defending it, and in this position follows pawn to h4. White attempts at minimum to crack open the defensive structure surrounding the kingside, pawn to h5. Fischer, with unwavering control, gives White 0 opportunities. Now knight to e5 begins threatening knight to d7. White obtains some activity here. It's crucial to avoid blundering knight to d7, as then the f8 bishop would be forfeited, and Fischer could even face mate. However, simply king to g7. Now knight to d7 would be a blunder, since the black bishop no longer suffers a pin towards the king, and bishop to d6 would follow, creating a skewer on White's king and b8 queen. Therefore, initially king to g1. White removes the king from this dark square diagonal, and now we're presented with the climax of the game of the century. Bishop to c5 check. White's king commences his final journey. King to f1, a step forward into oblivion. The black rook completely seals off White's king along the second rank. Knight to g3 check. Only one retreat square, e1. Bishop to b4. The bishop joins from the right flank. Once more, the only retreat, king to d1, bishop to b3 check. At the conclusion of this difficult path, there exists no salvation for White's king. King to c1, knight to e2 check, the only retreat, king to b1, and knight to c3, the decisive blow against White's king, king to c1, and an elegant mate with rook to c2, completely sealing off White's king. Thus, the young, talented chess player Robert Fischer genuinely announced himself to the chess community and the world following this encounter. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed this analysis, and please show your support for me and the channel by subscribing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you over here.